Hi, folks. This is Megan Murray, Evaluation Coordinator for the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I'm here today to talk to you about evaluation foundations for prevention educators. This is a pre-recorded webinar for the Prevention Against Sexual Harm training. So to start off, I want to introduce our learning objectives for this session. I'm hoping that by the end of this session, you will leave with an understanding of the purpose of evaluation, an understanding of some helpful evaluation planning frameworks, and the ability to determine which evaluation methods will best meet your needs and those of your agency. So the first question we need to answer is, why do we need to evaluate prevention programming? We think our work is good. And that's great. We want to show you how to prove that your work is good. So these are all some common reasons that we choose to evaluate prevention work. If you don't currently evaluate or don't know which of these your questions aim to answer, please know that you're not alone. And it's never too late to go back to scratch or to start with the evaluations you currently have and talk about why you do these evaluations, what the purpose of them are. So best practice is really that you plan your evaluation as you plan the initial programming, and for all of your staff to know the plan and the purpose of that evaluation. But in reality, this sometimes ends up looking a little bit different. We often don't have the funding to plan on the front end for evaluation, or the time and capacity, the skills needed, that sort of thing. Evaluation can help us to understand all of the answers to all of the questions on this list here. It tells us if we're doing what we set out to do, if what we're doing is working, where it can be improved, whether it's the most cost efficient or the best use of our dollars. It can help us determine what programming should be expanded, and what we want to add to that evidence base that's out there, as well as checking that we're in line with our goals and grant objectives. Another important thing when we're talking about sexual violence is survivor voice. This is going to have a diminished role when we're talking about prevention work, as opposed to evaluating response to survivors. Survivor voice is going to be paramount there. But when we're talking about prevention, we also don't want to totally ignore survivor voice either. So I like to keep it still as a reminder here about how important that is. We don't necessarily want to be doing prevention work that survivors don't like either. So a really important foundational concept here is thinking like an evaluator. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that through this concept called evaluative thinking. So evaluative thinking is just thinking from an evaluation perspective. It's asking questions, it's thinking critically, looking for value and quality and significance in things. It's also having a habit of mind that wants to do better and that is making informed decisions, as well as making claims that have an explanation. So you want to be able to answer how you know what you know, and you want to have the thought process, not that bad evaluation results or negative evaluation results and feedback indicate that the programming is bad and we should stop doing it. Often negative feedback is going to tell you where the program can be improved. And if your goal is always to do better, then we should recognize that there's no way that the first time we do it, we're doing it perfect, or the 40th. We always want to improve our work. And that is a really healthy mindset to have in the sexual violence field, because it is a constantly evolving field. So an example that I like to share for prevention educators about thinking like an evaluator is thinking about presenting to an audience. If you're explaining a concept like consent, for example, and it's critical to the lesson that you're teaching that your audience understand that concept, it's very likely that you have some cues you look for to get a sense of if your audience understands what you're saying or not. So how do you know when your audience understands a concept and is ready to move on? You look for indicators, which might sound like it's a scientific term. It does come from science, but indicators are just things like head nodding, questions being answered correctly, and performance on an activity or an application of a skill. And all of this is data. So you're thinking like an evaluator when you make that decision to move on. You're looking for signs that your audience is understanding you, as well as probably looking for signs that somebody looks really confused. And you're making a determination from looking at those faces that, okay, we've reached the point that we get it, we can move on now. So next I want to talk about logic models. This is the first framework that I'm going to introduce for you today. Logic models are used in program development in addition to being helpful in evaluation planning. A logic model lays out what the expected outcomes are from a given intervention in a way that shows the logic, for lack of a better term, of the programming. So it shows that why you think that the program should work. And this can help you to identify the places that you can measure things to prove that the program works. So we're going to walk through the entire model, just as far as what's in the model. And then we're going to walk through it again with an example, talking about what these things look like. So if you're a little confused going through this first part, hang in there for a minute or two. We'll get to an example that I think might help different learning styles understand it. So starting with target population. In this case, who is affected means who is affected by your programming. So who does the programming serve or help? Who benefits from this community change? Who in the community are we trying to reach or affect? Are all good questions to be asking yourself while trying to define this one. And when we're talking about sexual violence, it might be a community, it might be a team within a community, and we'll talk more about that with examples. Next up, we have inputs. So inputs are the resources that you need, what needs to go into this system in order for our desired outcomes to come out. So as far as inputs, we have the questions that we ask ourselves are, what do we have and what do we need in order to make this happen? What will it cost us to offer the activities that we have planned? Activities, in this case, we're talking about programming being carried out. So this is where you'll ask yourself things like, what do we need to do to create the immediate outputs we're hoping to see? If you're not familiar with the term outputs, you will be in just a couple seconds. But to put that question differently, what new or different activities would it take to create the change we're hoping to see? What must be undertaken to make this change possible? And then outputs. So outputs are similar to outcomes, only in that people confuse them a lot. Outputs are the direct products of our activities. So this is going to be things like the count of the number of people that attended your attendance from your sessions, the number of sessions that you've provided. It's really how can we put numbers to show that we successfully carried out our activities and what is our reach. So outputs aren't necessarily going to be about an increase or a decrease, anything like that. It's just the numbers. Now, when we get to outcomes is where we start talking about changes. So we're talking about short-term outcomes here. These are the immediate results of those outputs. So because folks have been trained in a skill set, what knowledge, skills, and attitudes are we hoping that the program participants are going to walk away from the training with? And then we get to intermediate outcomes. So as a result of those changes in skills, attitudes, and behaviors, what changes can we expect to see in behavior and decision making? Excuse me, I meant to say skills, attitudes, and knowledge. What can we see in behaviors and decision making as a result of that? What changes do we expect to see in our program participants as far as the action that they take afterwards? So short term is focused on changes in attitudes and beliefs and ways of thinking. Intermediate is more about changes in the behavior and decision making, how folks are taking action. Then we get to long-term outcomes. Because folks are taking these actions and making changes in their behaviors and their decision making, what changes can be expected in the status or life conditions of this community? So what norms or standards have changed within our community? What changes have been made to policies and procedures or to the environment? And then we have our end in mind, the anticipated impacts. So if the program is carried out perfectly and we achieve our end goals, what would it look like in 10 to 20 years? And that might seem far out, but when we're talking about real primary prevention, we're thinking at least 10 to 20 years out before we see the anticipated impacts. So my favorite logic model trick is actually called, it's a trick called backwards mapping. And it means that we start from our anticipated impact and work our way backwards. For the programming that I dreamed up for this example, it's at a high school, and it includes social norms education, bystander intervention, and anti-oppression training. So starting at anticipated impacts, nothing too big. We're just going to make the school free from violence, and all youth will feel safe and supported. These feel like, I think, for folks that aren't in our field, they feel like things that aren't huge to ask, but those in our field understand how different this is from the world that we live in today. So what long-term outcomes, what changes in status and life conditions need to happen in order for that to be possible? The school needs to have a culture that is focused on safety and empowerment for all people, and oppressive comments can't be tolerated within the school in order for us to have a school that's free from violence and all youth can feel safe and supported. What changes do we need in behavior and decision making in order for those life conditions to be possible? Attendees need to take action to intervene when they see violence, and attendees need to take action to address oppressive and inappropriate comments made by others. So in order for those comments to not be tolerated, people have to not tolerate them. In order for everyone to feel safe, people have to feel safe to intervene to prevent violence. How do we make folks feel comfortable and safe taking those actions? What changes do they need to have in skills, attitudes, and knowledge? Attendees will be able to recognize dangerous situations. They can recognize oppressive language and policies, and they have skills and strategies to intervene when others are in need of support. And then how do we get them to have those changes in skills, attitudes, and knowledge? So youth who have been trained, the number of youth that have been trained are going to be those direct products, as well as the number of sessions of training provided. And then when we get to activities, we just fill in what we did, what that training looks like. So it's social norms education, it's bystander intervention curriculum, and it's an anti-oppression training. The detail of your logic model is totally up to you how in-depth you want it to be. I didn't necessarily want to think through every detail of the activities for an example for folks. But if this was for the purpose of having this on hand for onboarding and things like that, I might spell it out a little more specifically, put the name of the curriculum that we use or more detail over what is in the individual sessions, because this logic model will likely outlive, while I hope it'll be updated, it will likely outlive you or someone on your staff and will have to be used for onboarding at some point in time. So it can be a really helpful way to give someone a full snapshot of the curriculum that you provide. And then there's inputs. So the inputs, like we talked about, the resources that are needed. In this case, I didn't get too creative. I put curricula, staff time, and space, but this also could include things like your staff need to be trained on the topic. It could include things like needing to market to your attendees if you're not doing something like this curriculum that would be in the school and required of students, that sort of thing. It could be things like stipends for students to participate, things like that. Really any material good that is needed or other resource is something that you would want to put on that list. And then who is being affected? In this case, I went simple and went with youth at a local high school. So as you can see from looking at this full logic model filled in all the way, our anticipated impacts are the goal of our programming: for the school to be free from violence and for all youth to feel safe and supported. We already know that those impacts are things that we're looking 10, 20 years in the future to see those outcomes. So it wouldn't really make much sense for us to look to the number of incidents of violence in a school on a monthly or quarterly or annual basis as a way of evaluating our primary prevention work. That just doesn't make sense because we don't want to wait 10 to 20 years to know if our work is working. So what we'll do is we'll look at those short-term and intermediate, and in some cases, maybe even long-term outcomes to see if we're on the right track. So we'll measure things like whether or not the attendees are able to recognize dangerous situations, recognize oppressive language and policies, and if they can demonstrate an understanding of the skills and strategies that they'll need to intervene in order to support others. We'll also maybe want to be able to look at changes in behavior, seeing if those actions are actually taken after the fact. If we have the capacity to evaluate in that way, that's awesome. Being able to look at long-term outcomes is even better. But generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with focusing on those short-term indicators that we're on the right track. All right, next up, we're going to talk about the evaluation planning process. Why do we need to evaluate is the first question that we ask ourselves in this process. We looked at that list at the beginning. I'm going to bring it back up in a second. But this is where you're going to define your audience and your purpose for your evaluation. So audience here is not audience for the strategy, it's audience for the evaluation results. So in most cases, your audience for your evaluation is going to include your funders. It's going to include your staff, probably. I hope so, because it should be focused on program improvement. Might include your community, might include the people specifically that participate in the programming. Or it might include none of these and be focused on your board or a new prospective funder. I think it's pretty unlikely that you're doing this many different evaluations that you're focusing on one of them specifically, but that could be the case, absolutely. And this is where you're going to identify your evaluation question or your purpose of your evaluation, excuse me. So now when we are discussing why we need to evaluate, we're talking about the purpose of the evaluation. This purpose should inform other planning decisions. While all of these questions may seem important to you looking through this list here, you don't need to measure all of these things at once. And in fact, I wouldn't recommend it. You should start by picking one or a couple that fit the needs of your programming at this point in time and focus your energy there. So maybe you just want to look for gaps that you can and things that you can improve, or you want to look at if you've accomplished what you've set out to do alongside also looking at gaps. Or maybe your funder is specifically asking you about cost effectiveness, and that's all that you want to look at. The answer to what questions you want to answer, if that makes sense, the reason that you choose will help you determine other things about the type of evaluation you're going to do. And I do want to briefly talk about broadly these two large areas of evaluation. There's two types of evaluation broadly, and those are impact evaluation and process evaluation, at least as far as what's most common in our field. So process are more often used for new programming, while impact is often used with the more established programs. The focus is more over there. As you can probably imagine, figuring out which of these you're going to do can inform your design and help you determine who to collect data from and the best methods for doing so. So impact evaluation, which like I said, is more focused on established programming, is going to focus on things like, does the program help our community participants and target population? Have the intended outcomes been attained? Were there any unintended outcomes? Does the program show impact to an extent that we should consider expanding? Or is the program meeting the needs of the community? So these questions you may notice are more focused on, like, were we able to do what we said we were going to do? Process evaluation, which as I mentioned is usually with newer programs, is more focused on how the program works rather than does it work. So is the program being implemented as intended? Is it reaching the people for whom it was designed? What are the active ingredients and how effective are those? Is it being delivered in the most effective way? And what organizational factors are helping or hindering our delivery? So you can understand why, particularly when we're talking about prevention work, process is going to be more helpful for these early interventions. I just told you when we were talking about logic models, the change we're hoping to see is 10, 20 years down the line. Now, that doesn't mean we can't do an impact evaluation. We just focus on those shorter and intermediate outcomes. We focus on the shorter term. But that being said, I think that process evaluation questions are often going to be a lot more helpful when we're talking about prevention work. Next up, we have what do I need to find out? And this is where you're going to decide on evaluation questions and design. Um, and resources are a really big factor in this step. As you can see, the factors that may influence your design include your evaluation questions, which also happens in this step, the target group that you're for your evaluation, the purpose of the evaluation, and the resources. Resources, I think, is probably one of the biggest ones here. You may think of design as what tools being used, but that will actually come later in this process. In this case, what we mean by design are things like, are we planning to do a pre and post test or only post? Are we going to have a control group, which is very uncommon when we're talking about sexual assault work, and I would say pretty rarely recommended. Sexual assault and domestic violence providers are most often going to be using a non-experimental design for their evaluation design, meaning we don't have any kind of control or comparison group, and we don't plan for long-term follow-up. We want to get our sessions in front of as many people as possible. So I don't see many agencies choosing to have control groups. That being said, if you have a really innovative program that you think you'd like to expand and replicate, maybe even publish as an evidence-based curriculum, you might want to consider doing a quasi-experimental or experimental design. This involves things like a control group, having longer-term follow-up, and using more rigorous methodology. If you're feeling like your agency is in a place to do so, please connect with me and I'm happy to provide some guidance on that. But for today, as I don't think most preventionists in Wisconsin are in that place, I will just say this. I highly recommend hiring an external evaluator or working with a university to do more rigorous evaluation for publishing purposes when possible. It gives the evaluation more credibility to have an external person do the evaluation, while saving your staff a lot of headaches and possibly even giving a student an opportunity to do a capstone or thesis that has some real world benefit. So we want to spend a little bit of time explaining the distinction between evaluation questions and survey questions, because I think this sometimes trips folks up. Evaluation questions is not the same thing as the questions that you put on your survey, though many of us, myself included, are guilty of conflating them at times. Evaluation questions are what you want to learn, while survey questions are what you will ask to gather the information. So we have a couple examples here. So we might want to learn what the youth we work with gain from our bystander intervention training. But we might ask them on a scale of 1 to 5 to tell them if they learned how to do these different things, or if they feel like they're prepared to do these different things. You could absolutely ask your participants, what did you learn from this program, as an open-ended question? And your answers might be useful. Or they might just be things like, we learned how to intervene. We learned warning signs for violence. We learned about the power of bystanders. Somebody might even just write that they learned some random fact that someone shared at some point that has nothing to do with bystander intervention, because that's sometimes how people use evaluations. These all might be accurate, and your staff may read through them and say, yay, this shows we were successful. But it can be hard to report if people don't have a sense of what you're looking for. While you might get some useful or interesting things from the open-ended question, one person naming that they learned about the power of bystanders doesn't mean that they didn't also learn about warning signs, but you didn't ask them that, and they didn't think of it based off your open-ended question. So it's less likely, if we're using open-ended questions that are not specific, it's less likely that we'll end up getting information that can answer the questions on our logic model. You always can ask a question that's an additional, please share anything else about what you learned in this session, that sort of question. It helps identify any unintended outcomes in my experience. But if you want to be able to say that 75% of the youth who attended your bystander intervention training know about direct intervention, distraction, delegation strategies that they can use to intervene in a violent situation, you need to ask them more specifically about that. So next up, we need to determine what we will measure. And what we're talking about here is Outcomes and outputs, our program logic and the theory is going to be really helpful here, as well as we're going to talk about selecting indicators. How will you know when those outcomes are met? So first up, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between outputs and outcomes, even though I know we did discuss these terms a little with logic models. So just to differentiate better for y'all, outputs are the direct, immediate result of your programming, whereas the outcome is the change we expect as a result of those outputs. So outputs are really simple, unambiguous. It's just something to be observed, whereas outcomes require a little more data collection beyond observation. To put this really simply, outputs are the cause, outcomes are the effect. And I have a couple examples for you here. So when we're talking about an output in a bystander intervention training, we have the number of community members that are trained in bystander skills. When we're talking about outcomes, we're talking about those community members having a better understanding of sexual violence and an increased likelihood to take action to stop violence against others as a result of that training. So I think a lot of times in our field, we want to collapse these together and jump right to thinking about outcomes, but outputs are a stop along the way. Because we have this many people trained, we have this many people prepared to enact these skills. And here I've brought up a sample logic model. This one's might be a little more overwhelming than the one we looked at before because we have some key evaluation questions and indicators listed there. And I just bring this up to highlight for you that first off, looking at these indicators at the bottom, examples of what kinds of things you measure for different kinds of outcomes and outputs, as well as to point out explicitly that there are some indicators that are connected to outputs. Their evaluation doesn't always have to be focused on outcomes. Even sometimes when funders say that they want you to do outcome evaluation, they're kind of conflating outputs and outcomes. Not always. Sometimes they do expect that you're doing those short or intermediate term outcomes. Rarely are we looking at long-term outcomes in sexual assault prevention work. But for some things, if we're talking about a process-focused evaluation and we're talking about trying to figure out if the curriculum was delivered, if all sessions were delivered, if we're trying to figure out if parents attended that we intended to, if we did this program, if this programming is for parents, things like that that can be observed are still valuable for our evaluation and really important to keep in mind. And now that we've determined what we want to measure, we're going to talk about how we'll measure that. So the first distinction that you need or decision that you need to make in this area is about types of data that you want to work with. And this one will be a little bit reliant on decisions you'll make in the next step as well, because you might decide you want to use a tool that requires one or the other. But broadly speaking, this decision is about whether you want to work with quantitative data or qualitative data. So quantitative data is numbers, counting things like how many or how often, how many people attend your training, how frequently you see someone coming back. Qualitative data is more about quality, about the why or how of something, attitudes and beliefs. So there are going to be evaluation questions that are better suited to one or the other. There's also benefits and drawbacks to each of these. One general thing is that quantitative data often involves data analysis that relies on skills that most people learned in kindergarten through 12th grade education or in introductory statistics classes, whereas qualitative sometimes is a little more complex. So I do recommend keeping in mind the capacity of your staff, the statistic knowledge that you have available to work with. And then you'll also have to make decisions about data collection methods. And we're going to talk about data collection methods on the next slide. So we're going to walk through these different methods. Surveys are overwhelmingly the most popular form of evaluation for sexual assault and domestic violence providers for prevention and for intervention. For many, they really are the only feasible option because they are least invasive, when compared with a lot of other methods, while still giving the respondent the agency to respond in a way that they might not have with something like document analysis. They can control what information you have and what you don't. Um, Document analysis, in my opinion, is an underrated method. And this is just take the time to consider what info you might have available to you from things like census data, data from schools or community centers that you may work with, even just your staff notes, maybe documents that you can analyze, depending on how consistently you have staff document things like attendance. For some evaluation questions, like if you're trying to describe who's being served and who isn't being reached in your community, that might be all that you need. I will say that it's probably not going to be your full evaluation, but if that's one of your evaluation questions, you can answer that without asking your audience any questions. Interviews can be great for needs assessments. Say you're considering expanding your work to a new community and you want to get input from a professional who already works with your new target population. That can be great, but they can be pretty time consuming. So you probably wouldn't want to utilize them as your primary means of evaluating your sessions. You don't want to do an interview with every single attendee. And now we have a few more methods on this slide. So observations is another one that I think is underutilized. I think it's particularly well suited to prevention work. As long as you have an objective tool and everyone on your staff is trained to use it in the same way, you can use activities, worksheets, or your observations from an activity in a session to evaluate. The reason I think this fits prevention really well is that we usually already utilize some application activities. So it's just a matter of finding a way to record it consistently and make sure that it's implemented in a consistent way to make sure that it's as scientific as possible. But this could be something like having students change song lyrics and then grading the activity on a rubric. Doing a short quiz on topics like consent to see if they remember definitions, collecting and scoring it, or even just an observation of something like students were able to define consent when asked to recall from the last session. This might not be the most rigorous way to go about it, but it could be a way to know if you're ready to move on during this session. This method has some limitations, but so do others. This one's biggest limitation is that it can be pretty subjective, which is why it's really important to have clear definitions for success and very objective tools for this method. For example, if as a part of your evaluation, you want to measure the understanding that the audience has of consent in the beginning of session 2 when you learned the concept in session 1, there should be a very clear list of components that the youth have to touch on to have gotten the definition correct, meaning just saying permission is not enough. Saying things like freely given, revocable, things like that might be a part of your definition. And there should be a clear list of components for your staff to check off, probably on some kind of formalized tool to make sure that this is done in the same way every time, or at least graded in the same way every time. It's all about choosing your data collection methods are all about balancing limitations and finding the right fit for your agency. The other two that I have listed here are also some that I think aren't super commonly going to be used in prevention. Focus groups are one that I know people really like them, and I can totally see why. We're a field that really likes to center voices of people that are most affected, whether that's survivors or if we're talking about youth with our prevention work. We like to let people share what they want to say in their own words. And it really is pretty fantastic from the standpoint of survivor voice. But we value those voices so much in this work. But focus groups are also a lot of effort for everyone involved, including those providing feedback in them. I have some great focus group resources to share with you if you're interested in going that route, but I do recommend considering and being really thoughtful about whether or not the focus group that you want to do is beneficial and is necessary. Survivors have sat through a lot of focus groups, so have community members, especially those of color. I recommend looking to see if research has already been done on the population that you want to do a focus group with about the topic that you want to do a focus group with, and looking at those documents that that academic research as a less invasive way to learn the information that you're trying to learn. Another factor to consider is how you'll actually use that information, because another piece of having folks sit through too many focus groups is that their feedback is often dismissed or ignored, which can be really re-traumatizing. Logistically speaking, I'm happy to provide support around focus groups. However, I do always recommend that programs explore options of hiring an external evaluator or partnering with a university to conduct focus groups, as they can be quite time consuming and they usually require working with qualitative data, which can be much more complex to work with. The last one listed here, case studies, are going to be really, really rarely used in sexual violence work. Well, sexual violence prevention work, I should say. But they are focusing on one person or one group's experience in depth. The only reason I could see someone using this in prevention would be very new programming. And I would still think that you'd be looking at the group, not necessarily the individual. And now we have some important considerations here for selecting the right tool. You'll want to consider the needs of the population that you're working with. Surveys might not be the right way to go. If, for example, you're working with very young children, um, or uh, or for example, you might want to avoid something like focus groups if the population that you're working with uh, is likely to need childcare in order to participate and you're unable to provide it. Um, another consideration that you'll want to have here is around cultural appropriateness. So for example, if you're using a survey, that survey should reflect the language and culture of the respondents. This goes for age, race, gender, really any area of identity that you know about the group. Some populations are historically over-surveyed, which is another consideration. This is one of those situations that I actually would say, if you think that a focus group is a better fit for your community because your community is over-surveyed and folks don't like to return surveys, that's absolutely a valid reason to go the route of a really well-structured focus group or listening session. Your evaluation questions are going to be another consideration here because, as I mentioned, certain methods and tools are going to be a better fit for certain questions. Your questions should inform your choice of data collection tool, not the other way around. Another important consideration is your time commitment and agency capacity. You want to be realistic about how much time and resources you have to spend on evaluation, your staff's level of expertise in data management and analysis, and how much time you want the folks you serve to spend providing you with data. We could collect tons of information that could be very useful. And if we don't have the time and skills to enter and analyze it, it's just a big waste of everyone's time. You would be better off with a more limited scope for the evaluation and simple evaluation questions that allow you to choose your tools based off what is realistic. Access is another really important piece here. It can be difficult to develop your own tools, so I recommend looking at standardized measures and other tools that have already been tested and validated first. You always want to make sure that those are available for your use legally. Most of the time, if you're not planning to publish, that's not a big deal, but it's always something that you want to check. And often all that you have to do to utilize something legally is email the person who developed it and ask for their permission. They're very used to getting these emails and they'll respond. This decision tree that I have here is really helpful for deciding whether or not you need to develop a new tool. So it walks you through these questions around in what ways you would need to adapt the tool, or if you need to develop your own, if you have that expertise, and your different options in that area. This map here shows some things to consider if you have determined that that the right choice is to develop your own tool. Not all of these are going to matter in necessarily the way that they're presented here, so let's walk through them a little bit. I'm going to start with the clarity branch of this decision tree because it is one of the more important ones. You want to be sure to avoid jargon and acronyms, including terms that you may have just taught the audience during your sessions. This is just for the sake of knowing that folks really do understand the definitions. You want to define what you're saying. You want to be specific about what you mean. You want to keep questions simple and avoid ambiguous language. So there shouldn't be two different responses that you can tell folks took questions in different ways. And that's one of the things that you'll identify from piloting a survey after you've put it together. You want to ask maybe the other staff at your agency to fill it out, or some young people that are involved in like a youth advisory group for you, things like that. I'm going to jump down to flow now. Flow is one that I think matters a lot more on the for-profit end than it does for us in a lot of ways. But some of the things that you will want to worry about here are you want to group topics together to avoid folks getting confused. You want to ask important questions early, particularly if your survey is long and you're worried folks might not finish it. So anything that you absolutely need for grant reporting, assuming it's not going to be really jarring to have be your first question, because we do want to the best of our ability, keep that start easy piece in mind. You want to ask questions early if you absolutely need the answers. Keeping it short is always ideal, as well as setting expectations and letting folks know before you start the survey. Not all surveys require skip logic, but if there are a lot of questions that will not be relevant to everyone, it is best practice to use it to avoid wasting folks' time. And putting demographics at the end. So a big caveat I have to this one is that I actually think that a lot of the time in our field, we don't need to collect demographics. Unless you have a plan for how you will use them, I don't recommend collecting them on your evaluation at least. In part because a lot of the time we collect them at intake if it is something that if the programming is something that they've done an intake before. If they have not, demographics often can be gathered by contacting the school or community center that you work with. Or if you don't have a plan of how you'll use them, you often don't need them. So if you need them for grant reporting, absolutely collect them. If you need them for reporting, you might not put them at the end necessarily if you have a long survey because you need them. So that's one of those places that we have to balance best practices there, because right under flow, these are already conflicting with each other, putting the important questions early and putting the demographics at the end if we need our demographics in order to do our grant report. So it's all about balancing the different best practices here. Relevance is another area. You want to think about who your audience is, think about if your language is relevant, as I mentioned. Consider the research purpose, and if you've planned for statistical analysis. Everywhere that I have time to remind you to plan this in advance, I will, but we're going to spend more time talking about it later. Objectivity is another good one. You want to avoid question bias. Anything that, one good example of question bias is a question that you think folks have a sense of the right answer to, something that there might be some kind of societal norm that makes one answer seem like the right answer around like judgment. I'm trying to think of an example. So for example, something like saying it's nice to help others, true or false. Most people know that socially speaking, the right answer is true. It is nice to help others. That doesn't necessarily mean that person agrees with that. It just means that they have been told enough that that is the right answer. So thinking about that, if a question has an obvious emotional bias or pull in one direction or the other, you want to space your choices evenly. That's one that's often going to be done for you nowadays. Between if it's a paper survey, you're probably typing it. But that kind of thing does matter as far as how folks look at the survey. So keeping that in mind, that you want things to look neat. Randomizing choices is sometimes necessary in our field, sometimes not. But that is another one around not wanting folks to think that there is a right or wrong answer. So if the way that your survey is set up, every single time the desired choice is the first one on the list, folks will pick up on that. And then you can't necessarily tell if the answers that they gave were honest. Look and feel is another one that I think is sometimes important in our field, sometimes not. Folks often don't care about having a progress bar or it being super visually appealing, but they do care about understanding like how to navigate the form. Which side is page 1 if it's a paper survey. We also want to remember about question structure. We want to limit open-ended questions where possible for clarity purposes, as well as because they are more burden on folks. You want to Uh, you want to make sure that your multiple choice questions are mutually exclusive, and you want to keep those questions simple, as well as always making sure that you have a non-applicable or neutral choice option. So next, we're going to discuss who will collect data from. Steps 4 and 5 are really closely tied, as your tool might end up being different depending on who you want to survey. I would say 99% of the time, we're talking about your program participants as far as the who here, but that's not always going to be the case. So you'll want to consider who can answer the questions that you have. Another important consideration here is something called sampling bias. Sampling bias is when there's something about the people that you survey as opposed to the people that you don't that may impact your evaluation. Now, this might sound a little confusing because if you're surveying your program participants, the difference between the folks that you survey and that you don't is they participated in your program. That's a perfectly okay difference. But often you don't have to survey all participants. There will be a lot of situations in which you run out of time after a session and can't survey this group, that kind of thing. But you should consider who's being included and who's not included and how this could bias the results. For example, if you already have your programming structured that you don't survey every single time, you do a survey maybe every 3 lessons. If that third lesson always consistently falls on a session that students who are in English as a second language support have to leave for that support, you have no way of knowing if the session is as relatable for them. Even though you probably wouldn't collect things in a way that you're comparing them, those students aren't even being included in your overall sample, and that's a problem. So you'd want to think about things like that. Who's not being included based off of the way that I'm doing my sampling? I'm bringing up this logic model again so we can have a look at the key evaluation questions here. Note that not all of these questions are necessarily best answered by program participants. Like so many other steps in this process, your evaluation questions should be informing your sample here. So evaluation of prevention programming usually involves surveying participants as a part of that evaluation. And I think that makes a lot of sense because like I've said, we value their voices a lot here. But timing can be a challenge. And there are some questions that might be better answered by others. Or just, maybe you're surveying your participants a lot. So there might be a question that you can sort of redirect to someone else to lighten their load a bit. So for example, a student in a classroom presentation can tell you if they understand the concept. They might be able to tell you afterwards if they applied it, but their teacher might be able to tell you that too. They might be able to tell you if they've seen a difference in the culture of their classroom. If we're trying to look at intermediate changes and seeing changes in how the students actually treat one another, that you might be able to ask that from an observer. Your questions and indicators should inform this step as well. And next up, we're going to talk about timing. So when will you collect your data? I alluded to that a little bit with talking about how sometimes we don't necessarily survey at every single session, and there's nothing wrong with that. So your evaluation questions may impact your timing, even with the same kind of data. For example, if you're trying to measure an understanding of concepts, which is a short-term outcome, that can be collected immediately after the session. But if you want changed behavior, if you want to collect data about behavior change, that's going to require some time for folks to put those new skills into action and then be able to report back to you about it. So I've seen programs ask about intended future behavior, which is a really awesome way to show attitudinal change, but it is technically not showing behavior change. So we want to think about the timing for that too. You can't ask immediately after about something that someone hasn't done yet. So you want to, when possible, you want to fit program activities into your time with participants. And evaluation is one of the program activities. So you want to try to fit that in. That's one of the reasons that I think activity-based assessment fits really well with prevention, because often you can do it without folks realizing that that's what you're doing. For things like behavior change, that follow-up is going to have to happen later, but you might want to find a way to build it in. If it's through if you're meeting with folks through a school or a community center, maybe try to see if you can talk to folks that coordinate other activities with that group, to see if it can still fit into some time, have some dedicated time for that data collection. Uh, we also want to discuss in advance what we're going to do with the data. You want to have a plan for your data analysis when you plan your evaluation, the same way that you want to plan your evaluation when you plan your programming. You want to regularly review and utilize data with your staff. Again, I don't want you to utilize data in a performance review kind of way, so much as in a continuous improvement kind of way. It's not that someone's doing their job poorly if they get bad evaluation feedback. It's that we need to figure out what they can do a little bit differently, what has worked better for others or for them in other sessions. And you want to talk about how you're going to share your data. The reasons that you want to talk about these things in advance are so that you don't end up collecting data that you can't use and to make the whole system of evaluation work a little better. But it's equally as important that you be able to communicate with folks about how you're going to use their data. This isn't required of you by any means, but it is ideal when you're asking someone to share information with you to tell them how it might be used. It might change the way that they respond. If I don't know what you're going to do with information, I might not speak super freely. I might not say identifying information. And folks don't need to share identifying information for it to be useful, by the way. But if I know that it's just going in your grant reports, I'm going to be really honest because you can choose whether or not you include it if you don't want your funder to see it. But also, I know that my community members, my fellow community members aren't going to see it. So I don't necessarily care if it's identifying for your funder. If I know that it's going to go out in the community, I might speak a little differently in the way that I phrase things. And it's important from an informed consent standpoint that folks have that information and are able to make those decisions. One major barrier to evaluation in general is a limited capacity for data entry, storage, and analysis. On the next slide, I have some resources for building skills in this area, but these are actually the resources that I have for shortcuts in this area. So if you use software like SurveyMonkey or Google Forms, which are both based online, so they're not even things that you have to download, they will essentially, it handles the data entry, storage, and analysis for you. If you do the web-based survey, the second that folks fill in that information, it's already in an Excel file that you can export from the website. If you don't, if you want to use in-person surveys or paper surveys, you can also collect a score sheet and have your staff enter it there in SurveyMonkey if the analysis piece is the part that's intimidating to you. It also makes data entry a little bit easier because you don't have to put it into a Excel file. You're just putting it into a form that is, for a lot of folks, a lot more user-friendly. Another great option is EpiInfo. It's a little bit less user-friendly, but it's also free, and we have a series of older webinars on it. That's one that you would create a form and enter it that way. It's not a web-based survey. It's just for the analysis, and you can also use an Excel file that's already a database there, and it'll create dashboards for you, or you can create dashboards in it, I should say. But so I know that data analysis and data entry aren't going to be everybody's thing. That's not why we went into this field. And they can be really time consuming, but they don't have to be if you utilize these tools. These tools allow you to build things on the front end so that your regular data analysis and entry are not as time consuming on a regular basis. And my understanding is that Google Sheets will also do the analysis for you. I have not used Google Sheets in this, or Google Forms in this way. So I can't speak to that, but I'm happy to help you figure it out if anyone is going that route. Some resources for analysis and data organization that we have here. We have WCASA's website. Normally, I try to link to specific resources, but our data page has a lot of PDFs. And unfortunately, because it's a file download, I can't link directly to those. But this is for the dealing with data page of the website. If you're looking for something more specific, because this has information about data entry, storage, and analysis for a few different data analysis programs. If you're looking for something specific, reach out to me and I'm happy to help you figure it out. If you have no idea where to start, reach out to me. I'm happy to help you figure that out too. I am personally very partial to good old-fashioned Excel, and I think it does most of the things that we need, but there are plenty of options out there, including a couple of free ones. So I'm happy to help you find the right fit for you. The next link there is the NSBRC Evaluation Toolkit. This has some great resources for evaluation in general, including an analysis section. The system usability scale is really helpful for if you're developing your own system, for assessing if it's something that seems like it's going to work and your whole team can get on board with it. The open intro statistics course here is for anyone who wants to learn how to do data analysis, and is brand new to this topic. It's super user friendly and it's free. You're also welcome to reach out to me anytime for technical assistance. I'm going to share a flyer about evaluation office hours later, but I provide evaluation TA all year long. So whatever your needs are, please feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to help you. And next, I'm just going to share some resources around evaluation of sexual violence prevention programming. This is not a super exhaustive or expansive list. I just want to highlight what is available to you for you to peruse on your own. As always, feel free to reach out to me if you're looking for something specific and I can point you in the right direction. There's just a lot of different options, so I didn't necessarily know where to start. But so this is a link to our evaluation page in general, as well as to our prevention measures database. We have them split into prevention, advocacy resources, and then there's also one for community level assessment and reflective resources like that. And those kind of tend to be useful both for advocacy and prevention folks. If you have no idea where to start, as with all of this, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help you figure out a starting point too. And then I just want to do a plug for evaluation office hours. These are one-on-one technical assistance appointments for individual agency evaluation technical assistance. I'm holding them quarterly. So we just had the one in September. We'll have one coming up in December that I'll be sending out the announcement for probably somewhere around early November. This is definitely not the only evaluation TA I provide. It just seems to help folks to have a quarterly opportunity to sign up and set some time aside to think about it. If you would like to connect outside of these office hours, you can always email me and we can find another time to meet. And please reach out to me if you have any questions. As you can see on the screen, my email is meganm@wcasa.org, and I am happy to chat about evaluation with you anytime. Thanks.